Hey guys, welcome back. It's Missy, and today we're going to be talking about something that's newly researched, and that's complex post-stress trauma, aka childhood PTSD. Complex PTSD is a little bit different from PTSD, where complex comes from childhood. It comes from childhood emotional abuse, physical abuse, or emotional neglect, physical neglect, and abandonment. Usually this comes from experience at a young age for long periods of time, especially from a caregiver, or it could happen because you're still in contact with that abuser. Another cause is insecure attachment, which I talk a lot about attachment styles in one of my earlier videos, where basically you had an insecure attachment and you didn't have a consistent caretaker. So that then causes you to avoid relationships or to become overly needy in your relationships. Now let's go into how childhood trauma affects the brain. So childhood trauma hurts the formation of a sense of self, and it also impairs the development of the brain. It can cause lasting effects on 3 parts of the brain: the amygdala, which is the center of your emotions and your emotional behavior, the hippocampus, which is memory and learning, and the prefrontal cortex, which has a lot of roles, but in terms of childhood trauma, it has to do with the processing of feelings. All these 3 work together. So the amygdala senses negative emotion and determines if it's a threat or not. With childhood trauma, because you're threatened more, your amygdala is going to go off more often. It's going to be more reactive. The prefrontal cortex reacts to that emotion. Because you're always in survival mode, your prefrontal cortex will react to triggers more often. And then the hippocampus puts it in your memory to remember, hey, that's a threat. So like I said, trauma causes your amygdala to be hyperactive. It causes the prefrontal cortex to have a hard time regulating the fear and other emotions. And the hippocampus can't tell the difference between past and present. So when memories or triggers pop up, it makes you feel like you're reliving the experience and the trauma all over again. Trauma also affects the way your neural pathways form and do not form. Neural pathways are signals sent to your nervous system, so they're neurons sent to other neurons in the nervous system, which affect your thinking and behavior. Trauma reduces neural pathways to the thinking part of your brain, which is dedicated to learning and reasoning, and it strengthens the neural pathways to your survival part of your brain, which makes you less able to cope with difficulties as you get older. As trauma causes your survival and your emotions part of your brain to be overactive and your reasoning to be underactive. So trauma can affect your memory, your thinking abilities, because of the fact that your neural pathways are strengthened towards always feeling like you're in survival mode, the emotional part of you. That's why it's so easy for you to react with your emotions. When you go through prolonged stress, it releases a lot of cortisol and adrenaline. That reduces your immune system, which makes you more prone to chronic illness. You may not realize, but people who suffer from trauma are more likely to get chronic illness. And want to hear something crazier? Trauma can actually be passed down because we learn healthy habits from our parents. Most of the time, our parents are traumatized as well. So they're then passing their trauma down to us. Study shows this is actually true. Researchers had studied children that came from Holocaust survivors, and those children were more likely to be traumatized. Not because they dealt with the Holocaust, but because their parents dealt with the Holocaust. And the reason why trauma survivors usually pass it down to their children is because we learn how to cope through stress by our parents. So we don't learn how to nurture or how to deal with our emotions in a healthy way. We learn that we need to survive. So now that we talked about how it affects your brain, let's talk about how it affects you now. One thing you may notice is that you have difficulty controlling your emotions. So you may go into rages or uncontrollable crying or extreme panic, and it usually is triggered by something. And these panic stages, you could go completely numb and frozen, and you could become paralyzed. You may get dysregulated, which I'll talk about later, but basically you will not be able to function at the full capacity like you are normally. you will maybe feel disorganized, or you will go into rages, or you'll just go into complete sadness, or like you're in a fog. You may notice you have a negative self-view. So you view yourself in a negative light and you feel a lot of shame, guilt, and helplessness. You may notice you have difficulty with relationships. So you may have a hard time maintaining relationships or forming healthy relationships with others. And you may notice you have a hard time trusting yourself and trusting others, so you may avoid relationships. Or you go into unhealthy relationships because that's what you knew. You may notice that maybe you have a detachment from the trauma. So when you speak about it, maybe you may be very numb, or you'll have a blank expression, or you will completely forget the trauma. It's like a long lost memory until you have a trigger where maybe a random memory may pop up. You will have decreased self-compassion and self-esteem. You may struggle with an addiction, whether that's sex and love, or alcohol, or drugs, or even you're addicted to work or relationships. You may notice you feel empty and hopeless, and maybe there's this empty feeling inside of you. That's why you will try to cover it with things like drugs, sex, alcohol, other things, just to fill that hole. You may notice you'll have a lot of avoidance, so maybe you'll have certain triggers. You don't realize they're triggers, but you know it's something that makes you uncomfortable, so you will completely avoid it and you'll live your life in avoidance. You may have hyperarousal, which means you get jumpy at loud noises, or if someone calls your name, you may be very jumpy, or you may feel disconnected from the world, feeling like no one really understands you. A big thing with complex trauma is you have a hard time identifying and managing and expressing your emotions, and you have little vocabulary to describe how you're feeling. So going into emotions, a big thing that is common with complex trauma is dysregulation. So what dysregulation is a person's inability to control their emotional response to stimuli. So you may notice yourself having a hard time regulating your emotions. Now, dysregulation is very common. All people get dysregulated. But the thing with people who suffer with complex trauma, they get dysregulated a lot more often, and it's for long periods of time, and they have more triggers. This also causes disruptions in your relationships and your daily functions. So every time you get dysregulated, you will notice that it's really hard for you to get back into daily life. You may become discombobulated, you may be very shaky, and it usually revolves on a certain trigger. Before you're triggered, you usually have an emotional flood all over your body. You may feel all of a sudden like a feeling of shame, a feeling of embarrassment, a feeling of rage. There's a feeling that overcomes you first, and then you usually respond to that emotional response. Now, triggers are different for everybody. A trigger could be that someone criticized you. A trigger could be that you saw someone getting yelled at. A trigger could be that you talked about your trauma. A trigger could be that you heard a loud noise. Whatever it is, there's some sort of trigger from something that has happened from your trauma that triggers you now to have that same response you had when you were a child. Now, usually what happens when a person who is triggered that's suffering from dysregulation, they will either cry or have an outburst. They may go into a rage. So you may notice yourself going to a rage, saying really horrible things that maybe you don't mean, maybe you can't control yourself. Maybe you'll go into an extreme panic where your heart will race, or you'll be very shaky and panicky. You may space out, or you may have a lot of numbness because that's your fight or flight kicking in. So you feel numbness in your hands or your body. You may have a lot of panicky symptoms. You may be very clumsy, say things you don't mean, or do things you don't want to do. You may become silent or very disconnected, or you deal with depersonalization where you don't feel like you're a part of your body. You feel like you're outside of your body and you don't recognize yourself. You may become very impulsive, or you may misread situations entirely. You may notice yourself overly eating, and probably sugar or carbs, because your body's looking for that high, for a way to deal with that stress. Dysregulation can last hours or even days. It can be hard to get back into the rhythm of things, because what happens with dysregulation is your brain waves are completely off. And so then your systems are off. So then it takes re-regulation to get back into it, which I'll talk about in a minute. Most people who deal with complex, they don't realize they're dealing with complex, but they know they're stuck in a negative cycle and they don't know how to get out of it. They notice themselves reacting out of rage and saying things they don't mean. They notice themselves maybe responding inappropriate to things. Maybe they notice themselves just always going into a panic or into a crying fit. Whatever it is, they notice that it's a problem and they say, I want to stop, I want to do better, but they don't know how to get out of it. And that's because they don't understand that they're dysregulated and they need to become re-regulated. So understand, all of this is not your fault. This is the result of trauma. So you reacting in the way that you do is literally a dysfunction in your brain. It's not you. So remember, it's not your fault. But don't worry, it doesn't mean you're just stuck like that. I have good news. There's ways to heal that. Your brain is very malleable. Although the emotional part of your brain is very reactive, your brain is very malleable and you can retrain your brain. So we're going to talk about some ways to help you retrain your brain and how to heal complex trauma. So here's some things that you can do all on your own. One of the first major things is that you need to deal with your dysregulation. And how you deal with that is, one, you need to recognize your triggers. So anytime you notice yourself having an extreme emotional reaction, you notice yourself having that extreme emotional response all over your body, you'll feel it. You feel it in your chest, you feel it in your stomach, you'll feel it in your hands, maybe you'll feel it in your throat, wherever it is. Notice that feeling and notice you are triggered. This is a trigger for you, whatever it is. Like I said, are you being criticized? Did you hear a loud noise? What is it that triggered you? When you recognize your triggers, you then know how to handle them better. So once you recognize your triggers, you know that you're most likely going to go in emotional response type of state. You're going into survival mode because that's how your brain immediately responds to things. It's always in survival mode. So the first thing is, wherever you are, you may need to take a pause. Let's say you're in a conversation, you may need to leave the conversation for a minute. Maybe you need to go into another room, you need to go to the bathroom, whatever it is, you need to go outside. If you're driving, maybe you need to pull over. If you're cooking, maybe stop cooking. The next thing you want to do is you want to do basically grounding techniques to bring yourself back to in your body, to realize what is going on so you don't go into that emotional reaction, that emotional state. So some things you could do is feel what's around you. Hold yourself onto the chair and put your butt on the chair and hold yourself there and feel your butt against the chair. Or you can squeeze yourself really tight, not in a harmful way, but squeeze yourself really tight to feel yourself. Or another thing is you can look at your hands and count your fingers, how many fingers you have, and say, I have 2 hands, I have 10 fingers. Another thing that's really helpful is to maybe eat a lemon. That's really helpful, especially with anxiety. It brings you back to what's going on, and you can feel that sense of taste, and it's like a zing. It's like, oops, we're back, we're in reality. Another major one is, of course, to breathe. Breathe in and out. You can count your breaths. You can tell yourself, breathe in, breathe out, breathe in, breathe out. All these things will help you to re-regulate because they're grounding techniques to bring you back to now, what's going on now, rather than going into that trauma fear response. So that's something you could do when you notice yourself about to dysregulate or you notice yourself dysregulated. Another thing that's really helpful is something called EFT, Emotional Freedom Technique. This is basically where you touch on your meridian points, so the energy hotspots. It's kind of similar to acupuncture without the needle. So if you're afraid of needles, you're good. And they're different spots. I don't remember the spots, but they're different spots, and you take 2 fingers and you tap on it and you say, even though I'm really stressed and I'm upset right now, I love and accept myself, flaws and all. This is supposed to bring balance to your body's energy. Tapping can reduce stress or a negative emotion, and you may feel restored. Some people say it's a placebo effect, but hear me out. We are energy. What we give out into the universe, we usually get back in return. So by you pressing on these points or you affirming these things, you are then talking yourself into a healthy, positive mindset. So placebo or not, it's still good to release that negative energy, what's bothering you, and then telling yourself, I love and accept myself, flaws and all. So you're not getting into that negative mindset, the terrible viewpoint you have of yourself. So still, it's opening neural pathways of the neurons now opening for positive self-talk. So don't knock until you try it. I've definitely tried it. People have actually cured their allergies from doing this. So who knows, there must be something to it. Another thing, which I always talk about, and that's journaling. Now, I feel like with this, the journaling, aside from the self-check-in that I always talk about, where you check in with yourself, ask yourself how you're feeling, which you definitely could do that. Another thing would be really good is to ask yourself your fears and also your angers of that day, things that really have made you pissed off. And I think aside from that, ask yourself, like, how am I going to deal with this? How do I want to deal with this? What do I need? So you give yourself a need to help you. Maybe you just, at that moment, you need to just let it out and now you're good. Maybe you notice you needed to go get a hug from someone. Whatever it is, it's good for you to get out all of that negative energy and all those negative feelings to bring yourself back to a more positive mindset. And you can also encourage yourself to say, okay, when I'm feeling this way, what am I gonna do? You kind of prepare yourself to deal with these emotions. And the last thing, which I'm really excited about, that I've been wanting to talk about on my channel since I first started a channel, and that's EMDR, which is eye movement desensitization reprocessing. So what EMDR is basically when you think about a memory, you don't have to talk about it, you think about a memory, and the practitioner that helps you with it has you move your eyes side to side, and they may do tapping and things like that, but it's a way to reprocess your memory so it's not as triggering. Research says EMDR has helped 77% of survivors. Let's go into a little why this works. So when you're traumatized as a child, it stores a trauma memory in your nervous system. Our brains don't know the difference between past and present. So when we remember something, we feel like it's actually happening. So when you remember something or a flashback happens, it feels like you're dealing with it all over again. That's why trauma you dealt with years ago, it can feel like you're still dealing with it current day. So it responds as if it's still happening. So what you're doing by moving your eyes back and forth, you're distracting yourself from what is going on in your mind, and it is reprocessing your trauma memory. So you as a trauma survivor can address the neural pathways through reprocessing memories. Now, if you are someone that when you speak about your traumas, you have a hard time and you feel like you can't speak about them, don't worry, this is different. It is completely different from speaking about your traumas. So what happens when you speak about something, it increases activity in the right part of your brain. That's where your memory, your sound, your sense of smell and your taste is. So like I said, your brain doesn't know the difference. So it's like when you remember these things and you smell it, or you have something that really reminds you of something, you feel like you're in it all over again. And that's what happens when you speak about something. And so when you are talking about your trauma, there's no really beginning, middle, and end. You're kind of just going through the entire story. So you'll have random sounds or images or emotions that will pop up, and that will cause panic or terror. But when you go through the trauma in your mind, it doesn't happen that same way, because you are going through the story. You know there's a beginning, middle, and end. You're going through the story and it's in your mind rather than speaking about it. And because when you're speaking about something, your brain moves faster than your lips. So it's a disconnect. But when you're remembering something, you're kind of going through it yourself and you're able to deal with it better. There's research that says you need to do it with a practitioner. There's some people that do it on their own, where they move their eyes side to side and they remember their traumas. So who knows what the best practice is, but if you really want to do it correctly, I would definitely say look up for a practitioner to help you with that. And it's really helped a lot of people deal with their traumas, because you're feeling less triggered to those traumas and you're reprocessing the way that you deal with those things. But these are some major ways that have really helped people deal with their trauma. And if you are a survivor, I'm really proud of you. Like, it's so hard dealing with complex. You feel crazy. You feel like you're so alone and it's not normal. But I'm telling you, I'm a survivor, and I'm telling you, you're completely normal. I used to go in rages and I was like, there's something wrong with me. But really, it's complex trauma. So hang in there. I'm really proud of you for all that you've done so far. And you're doing amazing. Don't beat yourself up. You're gonna get through this. So what do you guys think? Leave it all in the comments below. Please don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe, and share with someone that you think may need it. Until next time, thanks for watching. Bye guys. So you may notice you have a hard time dealing with difficulties, whereas someone as a child, it disturbs your formation of scent.